you know, we were talking very briefly in the office before this conversation about one of the challenges of Nasher XChange. And, you know, there is this aspect of it being an exhibition, but the question is, you know, how well does an exhibition hold together when it's dispersed across such a large geographic area? Is it really possible to see it all in one day and encompass it, and therefore does it make an exhibition? One of the precedents that we had in mind when talking about Nasher XChange was the sculpture project in Munster, which happens every 10 years and is spread throughout the city of Munster. So it's a much probably a smaller geographic area, but as you can see by the map of the most recent Munster project, there are something like 28 or 30 works of art that are displayed throughout the city. Most of these kinds of periodic installations of art in the public realm are not conceived as exhibitions. They may have a theme that attempts to bind the works of art together, but they are mainly efforts to kind of keep a finger on the pulse of practice, of current practice. So I'm curious from your perspectives, you know, as an exhibition of trying to provide a sense of the scope of practices of art in the public realm, you know, what are the challenges that Nasher XChange has for kind of holding together as an exhibition?
Well, I mean, one kind of, what I've always seen since the project was announced was that the unifying thing, if there's a unifying thing, is the way it's not unified and how it's spread out through the city. And what's different between Dallas and Munster, which is Dallas is a post-car, sprawling, geographically stretched, and also historically, socially, and politically divided city in some ways too. And so by creating this exhibition that can have bits and pieces everywhere that forces audiences who are interested in the art as the art to go out to these places to actually engage with other parts of the city they may not, and also to bring art, which is one of the ideas we were talking about. It's one of the kind of the core things when you start talking about what public art is bringing art out to a place that is not the museum, is very deliberately not the museum.
Yeah, I mean, I might add that working with public art or asking artists to make works outside of the walls of the museum in the public realm is by its nature an interaction with that city. And every city is different by its nature. Munster is very compact, it's an old European city, and it's one that you experience these works mostly by riding around on a bicycle. And you spend the day in this very kind of pastoral approach to leisurely riding around on a bicycle. Very different than the experience of Dallas, kind of post-car, as was being said. And you know, I really like this cover of the brochure booklet for this project, which is a map. And I mean, I think shows how big this city is. And if you kind of just compare these two, they're by their nature similar, but very different because the cities themselves are so different. And you know, what I would almost argue is that perhaps this project here in Dallas is not an exhibition, but 10 individual opportunities to go out into the landscape, and 10 opportunities either on the same day or 10 different days to explore the city. And that I think is really successful, similar to Munster. It's just a different kind of exploration because the nature of the city itself is very different.
Yeah.
So I would say, as the person who put over 10,000 miles on his car driving around Dallas, getting to know it, that the thing that is a challenge but is also the most positive part of this exhibition is that, you know, even for people who live in Dallas, which I'm sure most of you do, you know, we don't know our city completely. You know, even for me, it took about at least 6 months of driving around to understand all of the neighborhoods, to understand what North Dallas meant, what South Dallas meant, which East and West. And it was really interesting to create relationships while we were doing that with people who actually wanted to learn more about their own city. And Jeremy, our director of the Nasher, has been saying that from the beginning. You know, it's a challenge to get people to interact in different parts of the city because it is so big and there is so much distance. But I think it's one of the things that is a little different from Munster in terms of if we can get people to do that, it will be a real success. So.
I mean, in a way, one of maybe the 11th work in the project is the city of Dallas, right? So all of this is against the backdrop of the city. And maybe the 12th work is the Nasher itself, because one of the pieces is here. So I think that is completely successful and viable in the sense of these pieces were made in response to this city. And these artists were asked to come and do something here. And if they had been asked to go to Chicago or Minneapolis or another, their works would likely have been different because they were really responding to the local. And I think that public art always is about that challenge of what you find as an artist on the ground, and then as a viewer, what you see when you get there.
Yeah, and it's, you know, along those lines, thinking of the 11th project being the thing itself, or the city, or the way that the whole exchange program is operating with the city, it made me think, when I was thinking about it, of the most traditional forms of public art, which is old kind of monumental sculpture in ancient Rome or something, where there's a deliberate narrative being played out through, say, scenes or on the side of a stone column or something. And in the same way, each of these individual projects is activating a narrative in the context of the neighborhoods that they're happening.
Yeah, I mean, if you know, if part of certainly part of the purpose of or one of the driving factors in public art from over the past 50 years is getting out of the institution, getting out of the museum, getting out of the gallery, and really taking on the kind of potential richness in contexts that exist out in the city and out in real life. You know, it's not. You know, artists are of course free to accept or ignore the context in which they're working, but it seems like you know, if an artist is making the effort to work outside of the gallery or outside of the museum, there's certainly almost you know, if not a responsibility, an impulse to respond to the context in which they're working.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like each one of these artists has taken on that responsibility of responding to the site. That they have been responsive to the city of Dallas, and they've been responsive to the particular neighborhood that they chose or were matched up with, or, you know, encouraged to think about. And that makes it very unique. That makes this project incredibly Dallas-centric in a good way. You know, that these works couldn't be anywhere else because these artists are responding to the situation that they found here.
And was that part of the curatorial vision, I guess, when you were out with the artists touring to?
Yeah, you know, it was interesting when we first started this. I think the first thing obviously was to make sure that we had 10, which personally gave me a heart attack. But you know, other than that, I think the most important thing is what Rochelle was just talking about, was that the artist found their way in Dallas. And so that was Jed, Catherine, curator at the Nasher here too. It was our jobs to make them feel welcome, comfortable, and to at least try to find a theme that they could latch onto. And I think one of the things that makes this a little bit different too is we didn't necessarily have a package ready for them when they arrived. We might have had sites that we thought might be interesting, but in a lot of those cases, those things changed. So from a curatorial perspective, definitely 10, check, right? But the other thing is just to make sure that they felt like there was a thread that they could latch onto.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really kind of wonderful and interesting process, you know, for those of us who were, because you know, part of the project was introducing you know, the artists who are coming in from out of town. Obviously, for those who visited Dallas often or live in the city. You know, there's less kind of legwork to do to introduce them. But for those who are coming in from out of town, introducing them to the city in the broadest sense, and you know, one of the first things that's discussed is the fact that, you know, this is a city that grew tremendously after World War II, when, you know, you had the great expansion of the interstate highway system, and everyone, you know, the dream was you know, a home in the suburbs and a car, and that kind of freedom that implies. But of course, that means it's this vast area. And then there are all these fascinating neighborhoods with histories that are often, virtually unknown. And so, honestly, having to do that for people who aren't familiar with Dallas, really, I mean, from my perspective, I learned so much about Dallas and its history just from having to, be the kind of tour guide for others who are going to be asking those kinds of questions about it in order to think about what, they might potentially tackle as a work of art.
Which I guess, does raise one of the challenges in this type of project is when two of the artists are local, or a group of the artists, and then Good Bad and Vicki Meek. But when you're bringing in people from out of town who kind of fly in, and then if there's a social dynamic to their practice, then it's kind of learning the culture of the city on the fly, and the sensitivities that may come into play when you're doing that, when you're making, it's two places where, to me, it seems like that comes up a little bit is maybe Charles Long's piece, Fountainhead, when you're bringing in Ayn Rand in a city that has kind of, you wonder, well, how much is this playing off of a presumed kind of political environment that Dallas may be? How much is that true or not true? And then, and also Rachel Harrison's piece with, it almost could read as why are you doing a thing on public art when you got it right here,
Right.
So,
right, yeah.
It seems that brings some tension into the whole idea for it.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that, those are two very good points. So Fountainhead at North Park and Rachel's piece at City Hall. And both of those artists are interested in that duality, you know what I mean? And, Charles very specifically said to me, this idea of giving back was very important to him to sort of balance out the experience. And at City Hall, Jed and I have talked about this extensively. Rachel Harrison is probably the most well-read artist in art history, in the sense that I've ever met. And she's worked with Henry Moore before. And what I'm trying to say is that we were very lucky that all 10 artists, there's a profound respect for the place. For example, Charles Long actually had a show here at the McKinney Avenue Contemporary, and he spent hours and hours at North Park, and he loves it. Everything from the design to how it feels when you walk through it. So the level of respect from the artists was amazing, but they do love that sort of duality.
Yeah, for sure. Charles, I think that was the second curated, that's what I heard, the second show ever curated at the MAC was by Charles Long.
Yeah, it came from Yale.
Yeah.
But I think it's also, it's a huge responsibility on the part of the Nasher as well as on the part of these artists, because, once you work in the public, you're outside of your own walls. You can't control things, which includes you can't control how the public is going to respond. And with public art, there's always art and there's public, and public is people, right?
Segue.
Public is all of you, but also those people who are going to be seeing these works and interacting with these works and saying, what the heck is this, and why is it here, and how long is it here, and who plopped it here, and why, and this is a perfect example. This is Tilted Arc, and this is kind of where the history of this type of work starts, and it starts very badly. Obviously there's monuments and historic monuments well before Richard Serra's piece in New York, but this is the part of public art that kind of left a bad taste in people's mouths, and that's because the government, this is a GSA, Government Services Administration commission in the 80s, and this piece was hated by the people who worked on this plaza, and it was removed. And there are all kinds of reasons why. It's very, very complicated, but Richard Serra was commissioned to make a work of art. He responded to an RFP. Request for proposal. He ticked all the boxes. He was commissioned. He did everything right. The trick was that the people who worked there didn't want this. And that becomes a series of questions of what does the public want? And now this was New York at a very specific time. New York in the late 70s was on the verge of bankruptcy. Art was seen as something that could possibly solve social issues, could beautify the city. And while some of that is valid, the people who worked here wanted some benches. They wanted they wanted the garbage taken away. They wanted some basic amenities, and they got a piece of steel. So, today we respect Richard Serra, and you see Richard Serra pieces all over various cities throughout the world. But, this other quotient, which is what do the people want, starts to be something to be considered. I think there's lots of differences. This was a permanent commission. It was commissioned by the government. The time was different. What you're doing here is a temporary series of works, much more kind of interactive. And I think about how Habitat for Humanity helped kind of intervene with Lara's piece in that neighborhood, and real sensitivity.
Yeah.
But that wasn't always the case. And so we have to always think about the public who is on the receiving end of this thing being plopped in their community.
Yeah.
If you want to look at if you could do an opposite of tilted art, it's what Rick Lowe does in
Yes.
terms of socially engaged art or social
Yes.
sculpture, or what you want to call it, where the object or the material or the thing that is the art is very difficult to identify, because it's the dynamic that's created within the community
Yeah.
that is kind of the subject and the content at the same time.
Yes.
I think the main thing for us was, at the Nasher, was to try to find at least one community partner for all of the projects, to at least introduce ourselves to the community and make sure there was an advocate there working for us. Having said that, I mean, Rick Lowe is a really good example, and I know Alfredo Jaar is here today. These two experiences from a personal level, for me, learning how these artists work. Imagine being in the car with Rick Lowe. We drive into Vickery Meadow. He knows nothing about it. And within an hour, we're talking to 5 different people about what we could do, just ideas. And that's how he works. And Alfredo, you can imagine me walking into Parkland with Alfredo, Parkland Hospital, and he says, let's just see what happens. And within an hour and a half, we're in one of the head nurse's office. You know what I mean? That's awe-inspiring, And this idea of creating those relationships and learning from these artists of how to do it right, and to make sure that it's not just something that you impose on them, but it's something that they're going to work with you on, is a pretty powerful thing. I think everyone at the Nasher was very concerned with creating something that people felt like was there around them, rather than for them or with them. So it's something we did think about.
Yeah, speaking with Rick, the way he told the story, if I'm remembering it correctly, is that he did go to Vickery Meadow once, because people go see Vickery Meadows. It's you say all the diversity and the languages and the density, but you drive into Vickery Meadow and you don't see it right away. It's an apartment complex that were developed for singles in the 70s, and over many lifespans they've now completely changed, and for a number of reasons have been a real resettlement zone for all these refugees. And then it was the second trip, or later on in that trip, where you turn a block and you see people from an African nation in full traditional wear walking up the street, and it's kind of jarring. And I think that speaks to...
School came out. That's what it was. School was out, and everybody came out on the streets. That's what it was.
I think that speaks to one of the kind of the interesting subtexts of this specific project in the city, getting back to this example in Munster, is that, I think a question that's always been there is, how do you do public art in a car city? Because your traditional method is to go to places where people congregate, and it's harder to find those. North Park has always been the example. Well, North Park is where people in Dallas all come out, and it's our kind of city square kind of thing, but not necessarily downtown. So how do you think about where these things go, and how do you engage with it? It was one of the interesting elements of how all these artists have gone through figuring that out. Good, bad, decided television is the place where we all get together.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think one of the aspects of that none of the artists didn't happen to kind of tackle this particular issue for Dallas, but one of them is the fact that it is a kind of a car-dependent city, and one of the ideas that we had was maybe hoping that an artist might do something that incorporates that aspect of life in Dallas, or responds to that in some way. I mean, it's interesting, just as a historical note. Back in 1970, one of actually the first, I think it was the first work of art that the Nashers commissioned for North Park, was the Beverly Pepper Dallas Canal and Hillside, which is on the median coming into the parking of the shopping center on the south side. And this is Beverly Pepper. It's 1970. It's essentially, I mean, people could mistake it for a Robert Irwin. It's Corten steel that forms, that defines a landscape. And so it's kind of partially an earthwork. But it was made to be viewed from a car. I mean, it's this landscape that unfolds as you drive by it. It's interesting that, in 1970 she picked up on the fact that, Dallas, for better or worse, really is, tethered to their cars. Going back to something we were talking about before, this idea of exposure and public interaction, and it not always being good, but I think that even if people don't like something, even the people who really vehemently disliked Tilted Arc, the fact that they were exposed to it, I think, was of a benefit, even though it's along the lines of there's no such thing as bad publicity. So the controversy at least began, as a discussion about these issues. It's how important is just simply exposing people to works of art?
Well, I think, it's interesting. I think there's two aspects of that happen in this project or series of projects. One is, that we are being exposed to these artworks by going on a journey to see them. But listening to Alfredo yesterday talking about the piece here at the Nasher, I think is also very interesting because it is bringing people, and he said one of his intentions was to also bring people who wouldn't necessarily come to the Nasher here to see that work, and not just today, but hopefully over generations, as people have a kind of connection to through that piece. And maybe you can explain it a little bit more, but I do think that exposure to art and exposure to places is one of the things that public art can do. It's free, it's right in the backyard, you don't have to necessarily cross the threshold of the museum. You can encounter it on your own terms, and I think that's one of the great kind of democratic principles of art out of doors.
Yeah, it's funny that when you say public art, it seems like it sets up a dichotomy. Well, if this is public art, well, what's the other stuff? Private art?
Right.
Yes, there is art in private collections, but where exactly is it necessarily calls into mind all these questions of ownership. And so that democratizing element of actually going out and putting it does seem to be what distinguishes something as quote-unquote public art, and not just art that's like Spiral Jetty. That's just art that's out. It's not a piece. I don't think anyone would call that a piece of public art. So as soon as you say this is public art, that social kind of institutional element is necessarily brought into what the pieces are trying to do.
I mean, technically museums are public spaces, right? They're spaces that we want the public to come into. So, I would actually argue there is no such thing as public art. All art is public, just some is in different kinds of locations, which include museums and public spaces and private spaces and et cetera. But, I think that one of the things this kind of project can do is help break down that threshold, which sometimes can be scary for people to come into a museum, which for you is not a foreign place because you're all here, but for other people it may be a foreign place.
Yeah, in my other life, for several years here at the Nasher, was working in education, and with Anna and Colleen and others. And one of the interesting things about the museum is that we spend most of our time sort of breaking down the walls, especially with students, and making them feel comfortable, and making them feel like this is a place that is theirs. And so that sense of ownership is something that museums deal with every day, with regular patrons. But what I love about this public realm, again, we keep using that word because I guess there's no other better word to use, but is that especially with a lot of the projects in this show, these people that are sort of in the community around where we're placing these things, the sense of ownership is already there with their community. And so they're much more comfortable, I found anyway, in a really positive way, but also in a critical way, in the sense of art criticism, to ask, what this thing is and why is it here and how can I be a part of it. I can think of tons of different examples of working with Rick, even with the pier over at Fish Trap Lake, of people just walking up and engaging in a conversation. And believe it or not, those kinds of things are very free, you know what I mean? And quite frankly, people are, they're open with their opinions, and if they don't like it, we can sit there and discuss it with them. And I think that's a very freeing part of public art, that people have that ownership of their place already. So.
I'm curious. I have a series of images that, just to, if if they come up to draw reference to them. And of course, a lot of these come from Rochelle and her experience with the Public Art Fund in New York, and just this idea of part of the exciting thing about how artists are dealing with art in public spaces is the art is starting to occupy very unconventional spaces. And so here we have an image of Jenny Holzer, which this was in Times Square?
Yeah, this is in Times Square in the 80s, and it's part of a series called Messages to the Public. And this was actually Jenny's first LED piece. And a series of artists were asked, if they wanted to make pieces for the big board, and then there were fewer of these big boards, but in Times Square, and a number of artists took up the challenge, including Keith Haring and Barbara Kruger and others. And I think that it gave these artists the opportunity to experiment with working in a different way. For her, she really hit on something that has continued in her practice throughout. So I think it goes back to this question of responsiveness to place and to site and to opportunities that present themselves.
One of the challenges for organizing these kinds of public installations is, how do you get the big board at Times Square? How does that become a site for an artist to work with?
Yeah. Well, I think that in some ways it's not different to what you experienced here. It's all quite opportunistic in the sense that opportunities present themselves, and also you seek them out. So I think that sometimes an artist will say, I want to work in a skyscraper, and then you have to go and find that skyscraper. And in other cases, someone may come to you and say, there's an opportunity to use a space that's left over, and you try to matchmake between an artist and that opportunity. So I think that everybody works in the city in the context that they're in, and if you're working in the middle of New York, then you have these relationships with people, for example, who are in control of Times Square, whereas here you have relationships with people who are in charge of the Audubon Society or others. Sure. So I think that, in a way, comes from, or North Park, that comes from the kind of fluidity of the city.
Yeah, and you said occupy in this piece, and some of Alfredo's billboard pieces. It's another element of public. We've been talking about being sensitive to the community that you're working in, but there's also a sense of claiming public space, transgression, kind of political, occupation of the public sphere for an end or as part of the content. Mm-hmm. What's interesting about this project, I think, going back to the sensitivity of when you bring in artists who are less familiar with the city, there's that sensitivity. But one of the pieces I'm interested in here, I thought worked really well, was Vicki Meek's piece. Someone who's very familiar with Dallas and really understands, and therefore has the grounding and the footing to do what she did, which was something very subtle and something that maybe from out of town you wouldn't realize, but to bring to light these kind of forgotten histories that are this entire African American intellectual influence on this city is this kind of using the public space to kind of make that kind of that anti-censorship mark in a weird way, even if it's a kind of censorship understood in a different context.
This is a Sarah Z installation, also for Public Art Fund. And you can see what's inside. You can see the person's feet on the outside there. And then this is Oliver Eliason's Waterfall, one of them. Some of the structural problems in commissioning works in the public are daunting. It's something on the scale of waterfalls. Where do you start? You have to, there's so many kind of permissions and permits, and then finding the people who can, do the construction and do the irrigation. And how long did that take?
This project kind of came on a very fast track, given what it was, which was 4 waterfalls in the East River of New York, each 10 to 12 stories high, so 100 to 120 feet tall. There's 100,000 gallons of water being pumped every minute through these pipes. It came about in less than 2 years, which included the fundraising, the engineering, the permitting, and everything, which is kind of unheard of. But basically it started with a sketch on the back of a napkin from the artist who said, I think I'd like to make some waterfalls in the East River, and everyone said, you're out of your mind. But, really the reason that this came about, I think, is because people believed in the project, and people could envision that this would be something amazing. And really it came about because of great partnerships. The first one being with the City of New York. And the Public Art Fund is an independent 501c3 not-for-profit organization. It's not part of the city government in New York, but, and it has its own almost 40-year history now. But really partnering with the city is very important. I'm sure that in your enterprise here, you had to create all kinds of relationships with permitters, with expediters, with city officials, et cetera. And this was the same, just on a much more massive scale. Yeah, there were engineering challenges, there were fish challenges, there were tree challenges, there was pollution in the water challenge, I mean, all kinds of things. But, and basically the construction company that worked on this, Tishman Construction, which was another partner, I mean, they basically said, you will never get this done. You will never get this, and this permit. And I said, sure we will, what are they? I had no idea what we were up against, which included the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, the NYPD, the scuba team, you name it, we did it. So,
starting to get stressed out again.
Yeah.
Something is resonating with Steve right
I mean, put it this way, our organization had to buy a boat because it was a lot faster to get between these sites on the East River by boat than by car. So which meant I needed to find a construction engineer who had a boat license, things like that. I mean, there's always challenges, but on whatever scale there's challenges. I mean, this one is supersonic, but I think in every work of art, there are challenges and you put them in the public, then they just start to multiply because the artists who do this have never done this before. They have an idea and it is your job to try to help get them there, including nerves of steel and all kinds of other things like that.
I was talking to someone a couple of days ago and, just about the challenges, and I said that commissioning a work of art is like a shared delusion, because there's the artist who has this vision, and you buy into it wholeheartedly, and have to do, move heaven and earth sometimes to get it done, and you can never, even with lots of experience, you never fully imagine everything that needs to get done. One of the, it's one of the great challenges, but Stephen, you can probably talk to this. It's also really one of the probably the most heartening things about this project is the way that you find partners to do it and the dedication of those partners as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that we learned is, and I learned this from all of the artists in the show, is the worst that you can hear is no, and then try to find somebody that says yes. You know what I mean? So, and you probably will. Rachel Harrison's project is a very good point. It was very important for us to have her as part of this show. And we really wanted to have the Nasher and this experience be her first public art project. And, there's a staff member here who built a 25-foot tall, on wheels sort of replica model of the actual artwork that you see out there that we positioned on City Hall Plaza. And Rachel kept saying, put it closer to the Moore. And it ended up being 21 inches away where we would have to put the foundation away of the Moore. And everyone at City Hall was really receptive to that. And I think what it was is that, and Jed was part of this, Catherine, Jeremy, everyone here at the Nasher, is creating the conversation of trying to get people to understand what we're doing and that it's a partnership. And so all of those things sort of went away. And I have to admit that the permit office of the City of Dallas was the most understanding entity in this entire thing. And we're really champions of this project and we're very helpful. So it's about creating those relationships and trying to make people understand that it's a good thing for the city, which it is.
I think in the end of the day, artists are incredibly inspiring. And that I'm sure you went through, and that's how I felt working on all the projects I did. The reason why people buy in is because the sketch on the back of the napkin is really inspiring. I mean, we wouldn't think of doing that, but they think of doing that. And so, that inspired all kinds of people to want to get involved, to try as a challenge to do it and to solve it. And one of the best things I experienced was the water engineer, or he was actually a pump specialist who worked on this. We had all different kinds of engineers. But his first job out of college was designing the hydraulic system for the Sears Tower, for the water sprinkler system in the Sears Tower. And his last job before he retired was designing the pump system to get that water to pump and go over the top exactly the way Olafur wanted it to look, which had a certain amount of froth and a certain amount of foam, and it couldn't go too fast and it couldn't go too slow, and it couldn't shut down the pumps, and all kinds of things like this. And I have to say, the opportunity to work with an engineer who designed the hydraulic system for the Sears Tower, humbling, really humbling, And for him, it was like, oh my gosh, I get to make this thing. So, I think there's all kinds of mutual admiration, but it comes from artists being incredibly inspiring, and that's why I do what I do, and that's why, the Nasher does what it does, and that's why we do these things, because they have these ideas, and we can help them become real.
Yeah, I spent some time following Rick Lowe through his project for a feature I did in the latest E! magazine. And what's interesting about all of this kind of logistical stuff is what he does is say, he turns all those problems over to the people in the community and the volunteers that are on the project. And it's the logistics that end up becoming part of what he's trying to do. And one example someone who worked on it said was when this idea, we're going to do a market. And they said, that's great, we can shut down the street, that's really easy. What if we don't shut down the street? And, we should serve food. Well, can we get permits to serve food? So how does that change how we're imagining what you're doing? And it's working through all those things that he's getting done what he wants to get done, which is getting these people in this neighborhood who normally don't have an interaction to become kind of problem solving together and forging these new relationships and stuff.
We're running a little late, but I want to open it up a little bit to questions from the audience. If you all have questions for any of the panelists here. Yes.
I enjoyed seeing the image of the tilted off because I was in New York at the time, and I was an interior designer and doing a little public art too. And the hostility towards that piece was so immense. I think we are in a different environment today. We can encourage people more to participate and sign on to things. I think it's a lot easier these days. You have been one of the crusaders that went and helped educate us. So it's taking an artist that is challenging us. I think that the artist is challenging us with that piece there. We might even be able to today talk the public into accepting it, really, if we took the time to do it.
Well, the truth is, I think you're right. Times have changed, and I think that those experiences back then, which were so hostile and were so difficult, have helped break the ground to having the conversation. Now, if you walk in the streets of Amsterdam, you see Richard Serra work. If you walk in downtown St. Louis, you see Richard Serra work. And there have been pieces accepted in many cities, and I think it's because the conversation has opened up, and times have changed, and art has a different role, and funding is different, and
That brings me to my second comment, which is the second finish that you had placed up there very appropriately to stimulate me a little bit, because it said, protect us what we want or what we think we want. That's a provocative statement, and it's something you all must say too when you're finding the agreeable people to work with you on your project. That's all I have to say.
Yes, ma'am.
How long did it take to conceive the project, to plan it out, and to actually open it up? And also, are there any plans to have tours of some of the sites, perhaps not all of them, and open to the public, to schools, and other groups that might be interested?
Absolutely. Just to answer the first question, a little over 2 years. And honestly, we worked really, really fast. Something like this could take longer than that. So I think we did work fast. If anybody's interested in a tour, find me or find Anna. We do have information about those kinds of things. So yes, those things do exist. We do have opportunities. So yeah.
Yes, Kay.
First of all, thank you for opening up these these wonderful dialogues between artists and communities. If you project forward now at the end of the exhibition time, and I know some of them are going to go on past their planned time, what do you hope some of the outcomes of the conversations will be, both with the artists and the communities, and community Dallas in general? What are you hoping for down the road?
Well, I mean, I think when we started talking about this exhibition, there were several things that we hoped would come out of it. One is that we engage a much broader public in the conversation about the works of art, and the other aspect of it, of course, is that in placing these things around Dallas, we hope to, in one sense, really inform Dallas about itself, getting them to perhaps go to places that they had to which they had never been, and learn a little bit about those areas and the history of the city, because it is a city that is extraordinarily vast geographically, and has lots of human and environmental riches that are really extraordinary, that I think a lot of people are simply unaware of. And so this aspect of exposure to art, but also exposure to the city and each other, I think were kind of instrumental in our thinking in putting the exhibition together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing for us is the partnerships are the things that will last. The artworks are, obviously important, but moving forward, this idea that a museum can't anymore just be the place that it sits, and the doors always have to be open, which we're very good at the Nasher, but existing beyond and creating those relationships, I think is very important. And it's something that I think we're pretty proud of, and I hope we can continue to do with all of those partners. But the main thing I want to say is that you make 10 partners in a community, and that opens the door to 100 others that they're connected with. And that's, I think, what we hope the future holds for us. So.
Yes, ma'am.
This has nothing to do with the Nasher, but when I was driving on Henderson Avenue or Street from Munster to Knox, on the right-hand side, there's an open field and there's several sculptures there. It's not that big, but I was wondering if you know anything about that.
Yeah, that's the Henderson art project. It's been going on for 4 years, maybe?
3 or 4, yeah.
3 or 4, and it's just an independently organized group that I believe the way it works is they have submissions online and people can vote, and then whoever votes for those are the ones that go out temporarily and they switch through.
So they've never worked with any of the neighborhood groups?
Yeah, if you want to read a critique of it, you can go to Front Row and just Google Henderson Public Art. And, it's a fairly provocative piece.
That's how you wanted to answer the question the first time.
Paul.
2 scenarios. Rashad, you were talking about the Public Art Fund, and then let's on the other side of it, let's talk about city funding. Theoretically, what should be the balance between the artists, the community, or the artists and the donors under the 50C13 scenario when it comes to the creation and implementation of a piece of public art?
Well, I mean, I think everything should always start with the artist. The artists are the ones that have the vision to make these pieces. I think that very closely to that, there has to be a very tight interface with the site. That site may be controlled by an individual, a corporation, a government entity, etc. At the Public Art Fund, we saw ourselves as the facilitators and in some cases the matchmakers between these two. I mean, our job was to help the artists realize their pieces and help them have hopefully both accepted but also provocative roles in communities. Percent per art is a whole other kind of situation. I mean, it's complicated, it's on different government levels, there's percent for art on city levels, on state levels, on federal levels, and in some cases, that percent for art is a requirement in order to get an occupancy permit. So the thing that stands between a developer and opening that building is get some art in it. And that can be complicated because the goal, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, the goal of the developer is they don't necessarily have the artist vision in mind, they want the building open. So, it becomes, the whole percent for art programs throughout this country are very valuable because it ensures that art will be in buildings that the public goes into. On the other hand, every jurisdiction handles it a little bit differently. I participate in some percent for art, and now I live in Los Angeles, and I participate in some programs on behalf of the city government, and also on behalf of the federal government across the country. And the goal is really to up the game. And I think some of the entities like the Public Art Fund or Creative Time or things that happen in cities like this force the federal government and the percent for art programs to kind of up their game in terms of getting something that is going to be not only a good work of art, but something that makes sense in that building. And in that sense, they're the funders. The government is the funder. So, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know when you say what should be the percentage. I mean, I think artists should be dictating what they make as artworks, and hopefully they're working with entities that are helping that to be as practical, viable, and exciting for those who are going to see it as possible. That's my predicament. Say it again?
It seems to be strained at times around the United States.
Yes, I think it is because... Well, I don't know if it's a question of balance. I think in a way it goes back to Tilted Arc, and one of the real issues there is that was public money. This is very different than privately raised money. The waterfalls were built, and the Public Art Fund's projects were funded, 90% with private money. There was very, very little federal money that went into any of the projects that we did, especially this. So I think sometimes the strain comes from this sense of where that money comes from, and Tilted Arc is a prime example of that. That was public funding. And so, now we feel a little bit differently about the role of what the government should be in funding initiatives, and to be honest, that percentage of funding has dropped over time. The amount of money that the arts gets from departments of cultural affairs is very little. So the strain sometimes has to do with agendas, sometimes has to do with sources of money.
Well, and what we were talking about a little bit beforehand, and what you just touched on right as you started speaking, is the idea that the artist drives the idea. And I think what happens a lot in these percent for art programs is that trying to avoid a Tilted Arc situation where you're trying to bring into account, the needs of a given area and a given constituency and a given vision on the part of the city for the plan, is what you end up doing is kind of creating a scenario in which the project is almost half conceived just in kind of the subtext for the reason for the piece. Right. And then the artist comes in and there's a lot of strings attached. And so I think Public Art Fund and Creative Time have been instrumental in showing that you can allow artists freedom and artist-driven work, and it's not going to create a barrier that's going to keep federal workers out of their building and piss them off every rainy Monday morning. Yes. So everything's changed a little bit, and again, back to education.
I mean, if anything, I think we've come to learn to trust artists more. To say that the time of hating the Richard Serra to being happy to have a Richard Serra in your community is in part because we've come to respect and trust artists' voices more, and I think that's our job as organizers and facilitators, to continue to help people understand why artists do what they do.
Yeah. Why don't we, I think we've got some water and wine at the back, and we can continue the conversation a little more informally. So I want to thank all of you for coming and joining us on the panel today, and thank you all for coming and being part of it.